Welcome to this Salto customer story. My name is Eric Grubaugh. I run Stoic Software, where I coach NetSuite developers. And I'm here today with Tom Newton, the NetSuite solution lead on implementation projects at TeamBlue. Tom, thank you for being here. How are you doing?
Very well, thank you. Good to meet you.
I'd like to start with you just sort of setting the stage for us and telling us a little bit about your role at TeamBlue and this major NetSuite implementation project that's going on there.
Yeah, sure. So we are delivering a transformation project, which was launched in, I think, January 2024 to essentially implement NetSuite and therefore unify finance processes across the entire group. So at the point of inception, there were, I think, 17 ERP systems, around 20 finance teams and 120 people running finance across Europe, obviously in a hairball of completely different systems. So the idea is to get on a single central point of system, single source of information to help them operate more efficiently and effectively.
Okay. I imagine that's a whole bunch of different countries, different regulatory environments. Like we have a whole, like a hairball, I think is a great way to describe it.
Yeah, exactly. So we went live initially in August 24 with two pilot entities. So one was based in Czechoslovakia and one in the Netherlands. We then went live with two much larger entities in Denmark in October, and then nine Netherlands entities in January 2025. So you can see that the project is picking up pace now that global template has been implemented. So it's really, quite a sizable and aggressive timeline, really.
Yeah. How has that speed evolved and increased? How did we lay out that template and how did we get to the speed that we're at now?
I think the beauty of NetSuite itself is that once you've got a lot of the common processes set up, say customizations, workflows, PO workflows, vendor bill workflows, they generally work across all subsidiaries and really is then a case of really doing data migration. So I would say that the pressure is more on the large data migration team that we have rather than the NetSuite implementation team now, given that the template is in place. So a lot of the work that we're doing now is actually adding enhanced functionality or changing processes, or as you said, bringing in catering for different legal and regulatory compliance that we have for different countries that are being implemented.
What was the work like getting to the template initially, establishing the template, starting from nothing and getting to those first couple entities, getting them online?
Yeah, really good question. So we had a project team that was around 10 people at the time. So we had a process lead for order to cash, purchase to pay, record to report, a data migration team. We rely quite heavily on integration. So we're using Workato as the integration layer, and we've got several different billing systems that are all integrating into NetSuite. So that entire team really came together to build this sort of global template and implement NetSuite.
And what's the process look like for when whether it's one of the new customizations or one of the original sort of features to establish the template? What is the process like for that feature or task, whatever it is, coming from nothing to finished deployed feature? What's the life cycle of a feature in your situation?
Yeah, so we're working with numerous sandboxes. So we've obviously got our NetSuite production environment. We've got 5 sandboxes. So we have a development environment, which is sandbox 1. We've got a dedicated integration sandbox for testing all of the integrations from Workato. We have another dedicated sandbox for the data migration team. So that is for doing the data dry runs and getting sign off with a completely clean test environment before we move data into production. We've got a UAT sandbox. So anything that's going to be going into production in terms of configuration or customizations will go through a UAT process, obviously. And that sign off is done in the UAT sandbox. And we've also got a production support sandbox, which is refreshed very regularly for looking at production issues, essentially. So really the life cycle of a change would be we would develop it in the development environment. We do some system testing. When the developers are happy with it, it would then get moved into the UAT sandbox for user testing. And then only when it's approved there would it then be moved into production.
Okay. 5 sandboxes is more than I've ever worked with. I think 3 is the max that I've had to touch. How do you keep those sandboxes in production? How do you keep all of that in sync and flowing smoothly?
Yeah, great question. So I think this is where Salto comes in, because we obviously when I joined, there weren't any policies around how to develop or make changes to NetSuite really, or any change management process. So we've developed this whole process from scratch as the projects matured essentially. So we use Jira as a ticketing system. So everything will start life on a Jira ticket. We then use that Jira ticket to track the progress through the environments and ultimately into production. So anything that is supported by SDF or Salto, we always use Salto to do that deployment. And then anything that isn't supported by Salto, that's where we have to do manual configuration. And I'm sure you've been there before with 2 screens side by side, essentially copying and pasting configuration to make sure it's correct.
Yeah. I think anyone who's doing all manual stuff hears 5 sandboxes and loses their mind or starts cold sweating like I am. How often are you doing things manually? Is manual work the exception? Is it the rule? How often does that manual migration work come up?
I would say it's probably the exception, but there are certain things, and this isn't a Salto restriction, but it's really a NetSuite restriction in terms of objects that aren't supported by SDF. So I think the things that spring to mind are developing payment file formats for EFT templates. They're not supported by SDF, so you have to do that development manually and then copy and paste those across all the environments. Things like revenue recognition rules, they're not supported by SDF, so therefore they're not supported by Salto. So these are the types of things that are manual, and anything that's data, we would not use Salto for that. We would be using CSV updates for data.
Sure.
But I would say a typical deployment is probably 60-70% Salto and maybe 30 manual.
Okay. And what is Salto sort of doing on your behalf in that 60 to 70% of the work? What is it doing for you that you would otherwise have to do yourself?
I think the beauty with Salto is that you can select all of the objects that you want to deploy, and you can make a deployment package out of that. And then essentially it's taking it from your source environment and then loading it automatically into your target environment. So I've come from a background where I've used SDF before. So I've worked on projects before where I've always used SDF if it was supported. So I always like to use SDF over traditional bundling, because I think we all know we've had lots of issues with bundles with duplicate fields or duplicate, just a few issues with forms and so on. So being an SDF user, the main benefit for me is that Salto just is this great user interface that makes everything so simple at the click of a button.
Yeah, I think also coming from a background of SDF, the dependency management, like the toughest thing. SDF does not do that for you. You have to, and it will only do it one layer at a time, right? You have a custom form that references a field, which references a record, and so SDF will only tell you about one of those dependencies at a time. And so if anything is off, you got to go fix it one layer at a time.
Yeah, that's so true. I mean, I remember building a deployment at a previous client, so using SDF. And as you say, you have to identify those dependencies and then manually import the objects into the project. And then you do a validation again, and then you get the next one, and you have to manually import that object into the project. And I think the beauty of Salto is that because the entire object schema is fetched whenever you want. We set it up for once a day on Sandbox, and I think once an hour on production. But because Salto has all of those objects, it's just a case of going and clicking the objects that you want. And when you click on an object, Salto then identifies the dependencies on a different subtab. So you can actually just go and click the objects in that subtab and all of your dependencies are there. And that works really well with the way that we manage the Jira tickets. So if somebody, another one of our NetSuite consultants is asking to deploy a change from, development sandbox to UAT, for example, they will list all of the objects that need to be deployed in the Jira ticket. So it's just a case of me copying and pasting into Salto and finding them. But you also immediately get the dependencies list, which you can kind of cross-check against the objects supplied in the Jira ticket. So it's really good.
Fantastic. And then what about, so once something gets deployed, maybe from SB1 to SB2 or however it's laid out, whatever the right designations are, how do we keep going up? It seems like every feature goes through, with those sandboxes you laid out, at least 3 levels. It starts in one sandbox, goes to another one, and then goes to production, maybe goes to multiple sandboxes. And at some point needs to be synced probably to all of them. So how do we get from the dev sandbox, for instance, all the way up and distributed through the whole network of accounts that we have in play here?
Yeah, that's a really good point, and we do try and keep every single environment in line. I mean, there are occasions where something is particularly urgent, and we might make a fix direct in sandbox for the UAT environment, for example, but then we will always deploy that backwards to all of the environments and then forwards into production. So we do keep them all aligned. I use the promote button within Salto. So when you have various dependent objects selected as let's call it a deployment package, once you've moved that into the UAT environment and it's been tested, you can then just go back to the history and click on the promote button, which takes that entire selection of objects and then moves them into the next target environment. So it's really, really quick and easy using that function.
Excellent. I'm picturing what I would have to do to go through. I keep 5 sandboxes in sync with just SDF. It's not pretty. It's much harder than clicking one button, essentially. Can you tell me a little bit about the team layout here? You and the people supporting you, what sorts of roles are involved? What are the responsibilities? That sort of thing. How big is the team that we're talking about here?
Yeah, so I'm a NetSuite consultant with a consulting background. So we've got two NetSuite consultants that are also administrators in the team, but then we've also got another 1 or 2 developers that are in a different country. So we all kind of need to work together really on maybe different pieces of customizations or different changes. So there's a lot of people that are doing development work.
That's 4 people. That's just 4 people managing this huge. Obviously, there's more supporting roles, in each department and things like that. But 4 people supporting all these rollouts. That's impressive, I suppose. I don't know if I have a question about that, but it's very impressive. How would you say that Salto enables you and this small team to manage at the speed that you do?
So one of the benefits that I found with Salto, which I think is really, really intuitive and really good, is that when you select the objects that you want to deploy, first of all, Salto identifies whether that is a new object in the target environment or whether it's a modification. So if it's a new object, you can still drill in and look at the XML behind it, so you can kind of see the settings without going into the NetSuite UI and actually checking a custom field and looking at the settings, because you can see it in the file in Salto. For an object that is changing, when you click into the modification icon, what Salto does is it will highlight any of the changes in green. So let's say, for example, we have a ticket to give a user some additional permissions on a role. Let's say that the ticket says that a certain role needs, I don't know, non-GL impacting changes permission or something like that. When you click on the role name and then the modification icon, Salto will highlight in green where the change is. So you can see immediately that the change that's in Salto, that Salto has picked up, marries up with the description and the requirement in the ticket. So by doing that on each of the objects, it gives you confidence that the change that you're deploying is actually genuine compared to the requirements in the ticket, if that makes sense.
How do you go about identifying, I'm talking a lot about keeping these environments in sync because that's such a huge problem. When you have that many sandboxes, understanding what state each sandbox is in seems really complicated, I suppose. How do you manage that? How do you know the status or what's in what environment? Did this feature make it to all 5 sandboxes, or is it in 3 of them versus, how do you keep all of that straight?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I guess really we do it just by keeping the Jira ticket open until we know that we've made that change in all of the environments. So a Jira ticket will move through the boards from dev backlog to dev to sit to UAT. And then we have a ready to deploy status, which is ready to deploy to prod. And only when prod has been deployed, we mark that ticket as done. But we won't get to the ready to deploy status of the Jira ticket until it's gone through all of the sandboxes. So there is a manual element to managing it, obviously, and of course there is potential that we might need to make a shortcut. So we do it in instead of starting in SP1, we do it straight in Sandbox 4, the UAT environment, as I mentioned earlier. But again, the great thing with using Salto for deploying those objects is if there is a conflict between the source and the target, Salto will pick that up. So it won't just overwrite what's in the target if the only difference, so if not the only difference is the change that you're moving from one environment to another, if that makes sense. So Salto does show you when there's a conflict and gives you options to resolve that conflict by showing you the change that's been made in one sandbox versus the change that's been made in another. And you need to select the change, which is the correct one, and then use that for the deployments.
How quickly would you say, especially now that this template is involved and we have a lot of experience getting these new entities live, how quickly would you say you're able to stand up a new entity?
In terms of the configuration deployment, and this is not including data migration, which obviously takes a lot longer, which the volume of data and the sign off. But in terms of configuration, it's really, I would say, less than half a day really to do a deployment.
Wow, that's impressive. Again,
yeah, less than
how
half
did
a day.
you? Excellent. How did you learn Salto? How did you learn to get to use Salto in this way?
To be quite honest, I just taught myself, but I think the interface is very user friendly and quite intuitive. I did have an advantage coming from an SDF background, so I knew kind of the principles of SDF. But
Sure.
even so, I think the user interface in Salto, it's really clear how to manage the deployments. It's really easy, I think.
So no elaborate courses or anything like that. You were able to just pick it up all on your own.
Just picked it up. I mean, I think we had an hour or two introduction at the start, but because we're so busy on the project, I didn't then get many opportunities to have another hour with Salto training, and I've just managed to pick up and build this knowledge as I go.
What's something that I haven't asked about yet that's maybe interesting or useful that you find with Salto or with this complicated process that you guys are able to execute rapidly?
Yeah, I think going back to the way that Salto identifies changes really is one of my biggest benefits. So we've got a script developer that's an out and out JavaScript developer. So any customizations that we need to do, he will develop those. I'm not a script developer myself, but I can read and understand code. So when we're deploying a script file with the script deployment records, Salto will identify the changes, all of the changes, and highlight them in green. And I think it highlights deletions in red in the actual JavaScript file. So even though I'm not a developer myself, by looking down the file, I can see where the changes have been made. And again, I can cross-reference that to the Jira ticket to understand that the requirement that's in the ticket is by and large being satisfied by the change that I can see in the script file. So I think that's really, really useful.
I've heard quite a bit about sort of each the deployment, how the deployment flow goes, it sounds like there are some manual checkpoints. You're reviewing changes and cross-checking with the Jira ticket. How long does like a typical individual deployment take, whether it's from sandbox to sandbox or to production? How long do those deployment, including the manual effort that you're doing on the back end, how long does a typical deployment take you?
So now that the system is sort of stable and mature, a lot of the changes that we do are very much kind of ad hoc, new functionality or enhancements. So some of the deployments are relatively small. We may have only a handful of dependent objects, maybe 5 objects or 10 objects. So it always takes less than an hour to do a deployment.
Yeah.
Depending on what the change is. So if it's just a couple of new save searches or reports, this could take 5-10 minutes max to do a deployment, and that would
Sure.
cover going across all environments as well, because you just wait for the refresh, click the promote button, next environment, wait for the refresh, click the promote button. So all very simple.
What about rolling back? Have you ever had a significant deployment problem or had to roll something back? And how did that go? Or how would that go if you haven't had that?
Thankfully, we haven't had to do any rollbacks at the moment. So the rollback plan would obviously be to use Salto, which would remove the objects from the target environment, be that production or any other environments. I guess my concern with rollbacks would be that there would still be quite a large manual element in terms of identifying all of the manual changes, which are documented in the Jira ticket, and having to reverse those. I don't think NetSuite is typically great for doing rollbacks. But yeah, I think we would use Salto as best as possible.
I agree with you. It's almost always better to fix forward than try and roll back and recreate. It's almost always better to just like fix what's wrong and just keep stepping forward rather than trying to roll back and then gradually restore. Great. So being that you haven't had major rollback problems, how confident are you when you click the deploy button or the promote button? Is there any trepidation there, or is it pretty routine at this point?
Yeah, I would say it's fairly routine. I mean, I'm extremely confident clicking the deploy button. I mean, the first reason for that is that we always do effectively a dry run of the deployment by going from the development sandbox to the UAT sandbox. So if you had any issues, they would be identified at that point anyway. We then also do user testing on the configuration that's already been deployed using that method. So when we go to promote that into production, we've got high confidence that the deployment will go through without issues.
Fantastic. I love to hear about the rigor and the discipline and the benefits that we get to reap from that. So, okay, I'll ask again. Is there anything I didn't ask about or that you're itching to tell us about Salto or this project that you find fascinating or useful?
Yeah, so another process that I've implemented using Salto is that we, whenever you do a deployment, so I've mentioned before, we select the related objects, dependent objects. So that's a deployment package, I would like to call it. But within Salto, you get a history of all the deployments that you've done, and you have to specify a description for that deployment. So what we've did is that we used the Jira ticket reference number as that description. So if you go into Salto and an environment and look at the history tab, you'll just see Jira ticket, Jira ticket, Jira ticket in a big long list. So we've got an audit trail between all of the deployments that we do and that ticket within Jira. So when it comes to doing a system audit, we have that audit trail that can actually look at something that's been deployed and say, well, there's the Jira ticket for it, and there's the proof of the sign off in the Jira ticket, requirements being gathered. You can see the whole development process in that Jira ticket.
Are there have you identified any improvements or maybe future things you'd like to add to this process that you think Salto could enable?
I think the only thing that would make me extremely happy is if Salto could go further in terms of the objects that aren't supported by SDF.
Sure.
We know that Salto is obviously based on the SDF framework, so a lot of these limitations will be with NetSuite itself. But yeah, if you could find a way to leverage some form of technology to maybe do, I don't know, payment files or something like that. The things that you have to do manually with NetSuite would be a good win, I think.
So integrating more coverage of the different objects. Okay. Are there any other gaps you've identified or had to fill with other tools, other technology, or other manual processes?
Apart from the unsupported objects, really, where we have to go through that manual user interface configuration, that's the only gaps really that I can think of.
Right. Salto's covering pretty much everything else except for what it can't, because it's not allowed to. How often do you engage with Salto or Salto support, and how has that experience been?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So we don't really have many errors with Salto. So there was a scenario where we're trying to deploy some custom reports with financial layouts, and Salto just gave an unexpected error. So I think I reported that to the customer support. They're very responsive. What I did in the background was I went back to SDF as a fallback, and I tried to do that deployment using SDF, and ended up getting the same unexpected error with SDF. So by doing that, I was able to see that the issue wasn't actually with Salto, it was with SDF. I then went into the user interface and tried to download the XML file manually, and I had an unexpected error with that as well. So ultimately, I ended up raising that with NetSuite support, and the issue eventually was there were blank rows in the layouts, and the XML download couldn't handle that. But yeah, it was good to prove that the issue was a NetSuite issue and not a Salto issue in that case.
We're putting a lot of miles on Salto and not having to engage with support too often. That's always good to hear. Well, Tom, thank you so much for your time, for sharing your story, your experience with Salto, with TeamBlue. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks. It's been a pleasure.